My parents refused to acknowledge my partner, and it's driving a wedge between us. Hey everyone. I'm a 29-year-old guy and I've been with my partner, Nancy 30, for about 2 years now. We've been through a lot together, but there's this ongoing issue with my family that's just getting harder and harder to ignore. My parents are pretty old school. They put a lot of emphasis on tradition and staying close as a family. Growing up, they always made it clear that family comes first, and they've always had strong opinions on how things should be done. Now Nancy comes from a completely different background. They're from a different culture, and that's been a big sticking point for my parents since the beginning. They've never outright said it's an issue, but you can just feel it in the way they act whenever Nancy is around. I remember the first time I brought Nancy to a family dinner. It was one of those big gatherings where all my siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles show up. I thought it would be a chance for Nancy to get to know my family better, but it didn't go as I'd hoped. My parents were polite, sure, but it was that kind of polite that feels cold. Like, they made the usual small talk, but didn't ask anything deeper. Nothing that actually showed an interest in getting to know Nancy. It felt off, but I hoped maybe it was just because it was the first time and they needed to warm up. But that coldness never really went away. The next few times I brought Nancy around, it only got more obvious. My parents would barely acknowledge them, and even when Nancy tried to join in on conversations, my parents would either change the subject or just talk over them. It started to feel like they were actively shutting Nancy out, but whenever I tried to bring it up with them, they just brush it off, saying that they're just being themselves or that I was reading too much into things. After the third family dinner where this happened, I finally sat down with my parents and asked them to make an effort with Nancy. I tried to explain that it was important to me that they at least try to get to know the person I'm with, but they didn't take it seriously. They just said that I was making a big deal out of nothing, and that if Nancy felt uncomfortable, that was on them. Things hit a real low point during the family New Year celebration. It's a big tradition in my family. Every year we do this whole gift exchange and a toast at midnight. Everyone's included, even the newer partners of my cousins. But when the time came, my parents didn't include Nancy in the gift exchange. They didn't give them a gift, and they didn't even acknowledge them in the toast. Nancy just stood there watching everyone else participate, and I could see how hurt they were. It was awkward, and the whole evening had this weird tension that just kept building up. After we got home that night, I apologized to Nancy. I told them I had no idea my parents would be so dismissive and that I'd talk to them about it. Nancy was really understanding, but they admitted that they felt like they didn't belong and like my parents would never accept them. That was hard to hear because deep down I could see that they weren't wrong. When I tried bringing up the New Year's incident with my parents, they wouldn't hear it. They said Nancy was being too sensitive and that I was overreacting. They insisted that they didn't mean anything by it, but by this point it was clear to me that they had no intention of changing how they acted around Nancy. I started to notice that Nancy didn't really want to attend family events anymore. They'd always find an excuse, or if they did come they'd be a lot quieter than usual. It was like they'd given up on trying to win my parents over, and I couldn't blame them. I tried to be a mediator to get my parents to see that their actions were pushing Nancy away, but they just didn't see the problem. It was always the same response: we're just being ourselves. Nancy should try harder if they want to fit in. But Nancy had already been trying so hard, and it seemed like my parents weren't even meeting them halfway. When Nancy and I decided to move in together, things got even more tense. My parents thought it was too soon, that we were rushing into things even though we'd been together for nearly 2 years. They refused to visit our new place, saying it would be too awkward with Nancy living there. They made it sound like they were doing us a favor by staying away, but it just felt like another way for them to show that they didn't approve. Nancy told me that they felt like my parents just didn't want them around and that it was starting to affect how they saw our relationship. They wondered if I'd ever really be able to put them first if it meant going against my parents. That hit me hard because I never wanted to make Nancy feel like they were second in my life. But I was stuck trying to balance keeping the peace with my parents and being there for Nancy. I didn't know what to do, and the whole situation was wearing me down. My parents acted like they didn't see any issue, and Nancy was pulling away more and more.